All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Claire Donnelly, and I'm the gallery manager at the Visual Arts Center. We are delighted to present tonight's lecture in conjunction with the exhibition Between Two Worlds, which is on view at the VAC through November 20th. So I'm just going to give a few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. Please be advised that this lecture will be recorded by the co-host for educational purposes. These recordings will be shared publicly on the Visual Arts Center's website and social media platforms following the event. We will only be recording those participants who choose to leave their video on. By leaving your video on, you are consenting to the use of your image and video for educational and promotional purposes. Feel free to turn your video off during the lecture if you do not wish to be recorded. Unauthorized recordings of today's program are prohibited. Unauthorized recording is unethical and may also be a violation of university policy and state law. Please make sure you are muted at all times during the program. There will be a Q&A at the end, so please use the chat function to send your questions to the Q&A moderator, which you will see as an option in the chat list. They will go directly to our co-host, who will be moderating and presenting your questions to our speakers. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jesus Trevino, the curator of Between Two Worlds and a current MFA candidate in studio art at UT Austin.
Hi, yes, my name is Jesus. Like you said, I'm an MFA candidate here at UT Austin. I'm the curator of Between Two Worlds, which is an exhibition that's title is directly in homage to Américo Paredes, taken from a collection of poems that demonstrate how language can inform and contextualize cultural overlaps on the U.S.-Mexican border. Specifically, I'm thinking of, Brownsville, Texas, and Matamoros, Tamaulipas. And the 12 artists in this exhibition engage themes of identity, language, cultural conflict, folklore, and regional life along the border. As part of programming, we're here with, I'm super honored and happy to be here virtually with Ramón Saldívar, a fellow Brownsville native like Américo Paredes and most of the artists in this exhibition, including myself, and a colleague of Américo Paredes while teaching here at UT Austin. And he's here to give us, this lecture called Américo Paredes, A Life Between Two Worlds. Ramón Saldívar is a professor of English and Comparative Literature and the Hoagland Family Professor of Humanities and Science at Stanford University. Was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Barack Obama in 2012. In March 2013, President Obama appointed him to a 6-year term on the National Council on the Humanities, the advisory board of the National Endowment for the Humanities. He is a Base University Fellow in Undergraduate Studies and has served as a chair of the Department of English and the Department of Comparative Literature at the Stanford University. From 2012 to 2019, Professor Saldívar served as the Burke Family Director of the Binge Overseas Studies program at Stanford. He has also served as the director of the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. He was a faculty athletic representative from 2002 and 2005, and again in 2010 and 2011, and is currently serving on the Executive Council of the Modern Language Association. His teaching and research focus on the area of literary criticism and literary theory, 19th, 20th, and 21st century literary studies, the history of the novel and other narrative forms, issues concerning transnationalism and globalization, critical race theory, comparative studies in race and ethnicity, and US Latinx studies. He is the author and editor of 4 books and numerous other scholarly publications. In 2006, he was awarded the Modern Language Association Prize in US Latina and Latino and Chicano Literary and Cultural Studies for his book, The Borderlands of Culture, Américo Paredes and the Transnational Imaginary. During the 2019-2020 academic year, he was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. He is currently working on a new project tentatively titled The Racial Imaginary, Speculative Realism, and the Historical Fantasies in Contemporary American Fiction. So without further ado, Dr. Ramón Saldívar, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jesus. Before I get into my formal comments, I just want to say, a warm and heartfelt thanks to Jesus, to Claire Donnelly and Regina Balmaceda for making this event happen and for handling it so beautifully. And as Jesus mentioned, I'm a native Tejano. I'm from Brownsville, Texas. And I'm, an alumnus of the University of Texas, and I taught there. I taught at UT for 15 glorious years, of which I'm very proud, before I moved to Stanford. I've been here at California and at Stanford so long now. All of my friends, tell me, Ramon, don't fool yourself. You're not a Tejano anymore. You're a Californian. You're from California. And I don't know if that's really true or not. We'll see. I feel like it's not true. My topic for today is another native Tejano, Brownsville native by the name of Américo Paredes, a man whose work you may know. But in case you don't know all of the parameters of it, I'm going to try to fill in some of that for us today, and hopefully make this something that we all can learn from and talk about as we pose some questions. So I'm going to jump right in. The theme of our conversation today is Américo Paredes, A Life Between Two Worlds, in conjunction with the theme of the exhibition that Claire was just talking about, that Jesus mentioned as well. So Américo Paredes was one of the founders and early practitioners of what has come to be known as ethnic, race, and border critical studies in the US. At his death in 1999, Paredes really was one of the most respected of American intellectuals. Slide 2, please. Paredes' fame rests on his work of the 1950s through the 1980s on the ballads, legends, and everyday folk life of Mexican Americans from the US-Mexico border regions. His main work from this early period, however, is a book entitled With His Pistol in His Hand, A Border Ballad and Its Hero, in 1958, published in 1958, which is a masterful study that was really, in many ways, decades ahead of its time in its understanding of the complexity and the depth and interest of the US-Mexico borderlands. How so? Why is that the case? Well, with his pistol in his hand, first of all, went against the grain of the accepted analytical methods of the day. It combined literary, sociological, historical, and musicological analysis of the traditional border corridos, ballads, in many interesting new ways. And it also offered, very importantly, a critique of the accepted ideas and official histories of the relations between Anglos and Mexicans in Texas. Next slide, please. Typical of the official histories of the day, when Paredes was beginning to write his histories, were those by famous Texas historian Walter Prescott Webb. A recent article in Texas Monthly, just published a few months ago, points out how, quote, at one point, Paredes cites Webb's racist justification of Ranger atrocities against Mexicans from Webb's 1935 book, The Texas Rangers, A Century of Frontier Defense. In that work, Webb says this, he writes, quote, without disparagement, it may be said that there is a cruel streak in the Mexican nature, or so the history of Texas would lead one to believe, unquote. Well, Paredes felt like he had to reply to that. So that statement of Webb's leads to Paredes to reply sharply, quote, Professor Webb does not mean to be disparaging. One wonders what his opinion might have been when he was in a less scholarly mood and not looking at the Mexican from the objective point of view of the historian, close quotes. So before Paredes, the history of the borderlands were primarily seen through the Anglo-American imagination. After Paredes, the history of the region began to be seen in a very different way, reflecting the complicated realities of what makes up the border social world. Next slide, please. Paredes was very aware of the challenge to tradition his work was making. In the introduction to the same book, With His Pistol in His Hand, this is a woodcut from the first pages of the book of Gregorio Cortes. In this book, Paredes explicitly links the struggles for political rights and justice and of the border people of South Texas with the struggles of other peoples on the margins of power. Paredes argues that in attempting to understand the South Texas border, one needs to recognize the complicated cultural geography of the borderlands. The history of the border resides, he says, in the everyday stories of the Mexican American communities, in their jokes, in their songs and music, their food, as well as in their art and literature. His concerns were therefore very local and very specific, but he also argued that one could not understand the cultural, political forces that shaped the border without getting into those larger matters. For Paredes, border thinking and local histories are always coordinates of a much larger global pattern and global design. So he wanted to do both. Paredes' scholarly writings don't simply celebrate Mexican American culture. He certainly does celebrate and honor that culture's ingenuity, its imaginative power, and its passion. But he also continually urges that we ask what drives Mexican and American social and cultural spaces as places for the creation of national, regional, and racial identity. So Paredes says, quote, every Mexican knows that there are two Mexicos. One is found within the boundaries of the Mexican Republic. The second Mexico, the Mexico de afuera, Mexico abroad as Mexicans call it, is composed of all the persons of Mexican origin in the United States. So, two Mexicos, one inside Mexico and one outside Mexico in the US, he says. It's the composite hybrid of these two Mexicos that what Paredes called Greater Mexico. Paredes goes on to explain in one of his early essays. What is often not known is that the limits of Greater Mexico are not defined by the customs and immigrations offices at the official border. Instead, the regional folk cultures of Greater Mexico include the regions of two nations, he says. Notice what he's after here. His version of national identity thus cuts across political borderlines and customs and immigration checkpoints to include the everyday lifestyles and as well as the historical realities of the trans-border Mexican-American experience. So this is one way to understand what Paredes means to live, quote, between two worlds. Next slide, please. We get an idea of what it is like to live between two worlds throughout Paredes' earliest writings in poetry and fiction. To give you one taste of it, however, let me offer just one example from this book of poetry entitled Between Two Worlds. Now, the book was published in 1989, and it includes poetry written, however, as much as 50 years earlier. So in the prologue to the book, Paredes gives a little anecdote about how he went about choosing the poems for the book so long after they were composed. Paredes writes, next slide, please. I decided to borrow, he says, a strategy from border politics as I remembered them from the 1930s, namely the menos peor principle. When elections came around in my patria chica, one might hear exchanges like the following between compadres as they savored a few bottles of 3.2 at one of the local bars, assuming, of course, that they had got their poll taxes on their own. Next slide, please. And then he turns into this little imagined conversation. Oiga, compadre, ¿por quién va a votar usted? Pues la verdad que no sé, compadre, says the other man. Tan cabrón está el pinto como el colorado. Pero hay que votar, compadre. Vamos a pensarle un poco, a ver cuál de los dos es el menos peor. So let me translate the interaction. He says, well, compadre, who are you going to vote for? And the second man says, well, the truth is, I'm not sure, compadre. One seems as bad as the other to me. And so his buddy then responds, but you have to vote, compadre. Let's think about it a little bit and see which one of these two is the least worst. The first thing to notice in this little anecdote that Paredes gives us is the unapologetically bilingual nature of the little vignette. Then I think Spanish speakers among you probably notice that the proper Spanish word, the generally accepted Spanish word for worst is peor, P-E-O-R, and it's written as pior, P-I-O-R in this vignette. The same thing with verdad, truth. Verdad, the correct phrasing, the correct pronunciation of the word becomes shortened to verdad. Now, these little quirks are Paredes' attempts to catch the quality of South Texas speech. Its rhythms, its pacing, its pronunciation, and the accent of the vernacular South Texas Spanish. Pior, by the way, P-I-O-R, is actually Portuguese. So maybe there's a little bit of a pun and a play in that direction too. But in any case, in setting up this little scene, one might hear, as he says, between two compadres discussing voting at one of the local bars, Paredes also reminds us something very seriously, that the compadres may be able to vote if they've paid their poll tax. One had to pay a tax in order to vote in those days, remember. And if they had paid the poll tax on their own and not by their Anglo bosses who would then tell them how to vote. So aside from serving as an anecdote about how to choose the quote least worst option, menos peor, we get here a glimpse of Paredes' acerbic sense of humor and his sarcastic critique of Anglo domination of the borderland region. Next slide, please. So this is the Paredes that we mainly know, the scholar of the US-Mexico borderlands, the great artist and poet, fiction writer who identified many of the issues like voting rights that we still grapple with today. However, before the Américo Paredes who helped define the US-Mexico borderlands, there was another Américo Paredes. In 1945, Paredes, like many other young Mexican American men and women from Brownsville, the Rio Grande Valley, and the rest of Texas and the Southwest, shipped out for the war in the Pacific. Paredes landed in a devastated Nagoya, Japan in 1945. Nagoya had been the home of the site of Japanese aircraft industry, so it was especially heavily bombed. Paredes landed with the first American troops to arrive in post-war Japan to help take over that defeated country. Within a few weeks, Paredes was transferred to Tokyo to serve as a staff writer and then as the political editor for Pacific Stars and Stripes, the official newspaper of the US Armed Forces in the Pacific. Next slide, please. So and this is Paredes seated at the desk in the offices of Stars and Stripes, the man on the right, that is. As a reporter for Stars and Stripes, Paredes covered the aftermath of the war in the Pacific, the transformation of post-war Japan, the beginnings of the Chinese Revolution, and described the political climate in the months before the Korean War. How his experiences in Asia in the 1940s affected his understanding of Greater Mexico and of the borderlands in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s is what I want to share with you today. Next slide, please. After completing his tour of duty in the Army in 1947, Paredes stayed on in Japan, working for the International Red Cross, distributing medical supplies, coordinating humanitarian relief in Japan and China and Korea until the months just prior to the beginning of the Korean War. And in his spare time, he also did what he's doing in this picture. He worked at a US Army service that provided high school and college courses for American soldiers in Japan. Next slide, please. Through all of these events, Paredes was observing, thinking, and writing about the power of national cultures, languages, and literatures as activities that shape the process of nation dismantling and reforming. Next slide, please. From 1945 to 1950, Paredes was also writing short stories dealing with the immediate post-war period and the occupation of Japan that he was witnessing all around him. Many of these stories link domestic American racism with the conduct of US armed forces during the war and the post-war occupation of Japan. In all of his journalism and fiction, Paredes is interested in the global nature of the idioms of racism and their role in the construction of an American national subject. His stories are about how forms of racial hatred on the US-Mexico border are linked with Western colonialism and imperialism in Asia before, during, and after World War II. 7 of the short stories in particular that Paredes wrote in Japan take us from South Texas into the World War II Pacific Theater of Operations. One of these stories, and I'll just talk about this one of these stories is entitled Ichiro Kikuchi. This story is based on an actual experience of a young friend of Paredes' wife, Amelia Nakamini, and more about her in a few minutes. These stories, like the poems in Between Two Worlds, were also published 50 years after they were written. After Paredes had retired from UT Austin and had gone back and had time to go back to his early writings and publish what he had written as a young man. In this story that I'm talking about, Ichiro Kikuchi from The Ham and the Beans, the main character, Ichiro, is the son of a Japanese father and a Mexican mother, making him a mixed race Mexican-Japanese. Born and raised in Cuernavaca, Mexico, and baptized Juan Guadalupe, Ichiro Kikuchi grows up to young adulthood on his Japanese father's and Mexican uncle's farm in Mexico. But at his father's insistence that he not lose his Japanese identity and that he travel to Japan to maintain his identity, Ichiro finds himself unable to return to Mexico after the attack on Pearl Harbor. He's trapped there. So the young Japanese Mexican is drafted into the Japanese army, sent into action, where he's immediately captured by American forces in the Philippines. Ordered to fight to the death, Ichiro's unit was composed primarily of old men and schoolboys. By this time in the war, that was true for many Japanese units in the Pacific. And rather than fighting to the death, however, they decide to surrender, trusting that they can count on the goodwill of the American GIs who have captured them. Their faith turns out very badly for most of them. So they're about to be murdered. He's about to be murdered along with the rest of his entire unit. And Ichiro is ordered to dig his own grave. So he's digging at the ground. But then a funny thing happens. The American GI assigned to kill the prisoners notices something hanging and swinging from Ichiro's neck as he's digging his grave. The GI bends more closely to identify what it is. And this American soldier, who happens to be a Mexican American sergeant from the South Texas border, recognizes it as what else for a good Mexican boy than a medallion of the Virgen de Guadalupe. The medallion is like the magic token that changes the whole scene for the US Mexican American GI. It lifts Ichiro Kikuchi, Japanese infantryman, remember, from the anonymity of war's cruelty into a figure from home. All of a sudden, for the Mexican American soldier, Ichiro is not only a fellow Catholic, but is also, amazingly, a fellow Mexican. When Ichiro speaks in Spanish to the Mexican American GI, he really messes with the GI's mind and confirms what the GI has already figured out. So the story stops there. We don't know what happens next. It leaps forward in place and time to Tokyo after the war, when the American GI is walking along the street, glad to have survived the war, enjoying the scenes of downtown Tokyo. When who does he happen to run into on the street but Ichiro Kikuchi? As fate would have it, he amazingly runs into him in downtown Tokyo. Ichiro rushes up to the Mexican American soldier to thank him for having spared his life back in the Philippine jungles. But the Mexican American GI simply backs away, turns around, and walks away from Ichiro. The story ends there, without explaining why the Mexican American GI doesn't or can't acknowledge the Japanese Mexican whose life he spared during the war. But this leaves us to wonder why. Why can't the Mexican American GI accept the gratitude of this Japanese Mexican soldier for having spared his life? Probably because something like a memory of racial hatred from home returns us this moment too uncomfortably close to home. And so the Mexican American GI refuses to acknowledge that he has ever had anything to do with Ichiro or had anything in common with him. Here, Paredes is representing a situation that US soldiers of color faced sometimes in World War II, and is also anticipating the contradictions posed for Americans of color in other wars, in Korea and Vietnam, for example, and in our own time in the Middle East and Africa. In the fight between irreconcilable antagonists with merciless death, the goal of each side's efforts, the defining line between who is a compatriot and who is an enemy. What are war crimes and what is justifiable action? Those lines become as blurred and as ambiguous as the line between luck and fate. In these writings, Paredes is asking what it means for a member of a minority community to belong to the greater cultural national polity. Next slide, please. In my research, I've been able to identify 74 major articles and feature columns in Pacific Stars and Stripes and the Mexico City daily Universal, written by Américo Paredes on these and other subjects in the period right after the war, from 1945 to 1950. Composed, as he called them, from Tokyo and from China, desde Tokyo and desde China in the Spanish columns, the articles are on a variety of topics. They include pieces on the US supervision of the creation of a demilitarized, social democratic, anti-communist government for post-war Japan. He covers Japanese protests against the US occupation, food riots due to the shortage of adequate food supplies, and the war crime trials of Hideki Tojo and other Japanese military and civilian leaders. In his writings from post-war Japan, Paredes attempts to capture the despair of the exhausted and impoverished Japanese, their anguish and their regret, mixed with a birth of hope in a strange new social form and their simple joy at the end of the war. This period is called by the Japanese the Confusion Era. Next slide, please. What would this new post-war Asian world under American occupation look like, moving from feudalism to modern capitalism? What shape would its political forms and social traditions take? How would its language, media, and arts evolve? Next slide. And what would it be like to live in a homeland suddenly inundated with all of these mysteriously good-natured, rich white men who are now quietly but unmistakably in charge? Who were the new Japanese emerging from that defeat? Paredes' dispatches from the occupation frontline address all of these questions that arise from the dismantling of the old and the reforming of the new Japan, one that was more American. Next slide, please. So, what happened in Asia? How did his experiences as an American soldier, journalist, humanitarian aid worker affect his understanding of the US-Mexico borderlands on his return to Texas? What stands between Asia and the US borderlands? Paredes' articles for Stars and Stripes are not about Texas and the border, but about the economic and political turmoil in Japan. Next slide, please. In addition, he is interested in the social, in addition to the social and political crisis, Paredes reports on the changing political and social status of women with their first participation in the Japanese parliament. The new constitution after the war had given women the right as citizens to vote for the first time. In particular, he documents the increasing calls for the protection of working women. Next slide, please. In the devastation of post-war Japan, women were all too often being forced by desperation, by starvation, and absolute destitution to the margins of what people call respectable society. And Paredes writes on that too, on the emerging sex and entertainment industries around the Ginza commercial district of Tokyo. This matter of servicing the conquerors was a subject that Paredes addressed in his columns, as I say, from desde Tokyo and desde China for the Mexico City daily Universal at the same time. Next slide. To offer one example, let me show you these slides. In a magnificent Sunday feature spread of Stars and Stripes, Paredes offers a portrait of the sex industry as it, quote, blossomed forth from the ruins of Tokyo to provide nightlife and comfort to the occupying 250,000-man American army. The Ginza, reports Paredes, has become a surreal, quote, Japanese cross between Broadway and a Mexican marketplace. Next slide. You can buy almost anything on the Ginza, he continues. Cucumbers and shoes, strawberries and pearls, fish of all kinds, shapes and odors, postcards and supposedly eatable concoctions with a consistency of axle grease. All can be had on the Ginza, he says. Next slide. For a price, of course, he says. He ends this piece by saying, cabarets, dance halls, and nightclubs, which once populated Tokyo's Broadway, were banned during the war. But soon after the surrender, little spots like the Oasis of the Ginza, Eden, Manhattan, Marigold, and others well known to the American soldier blossomed forth from the ruins, unquote. Next slide, please. What is even more revealing than the pictorial sketch of the Ginza Paredes offers, however, is his description of the social transformation occasioned by the rebirth of the dance halls and the nightclubs. In the context of near starvation and desperation that I was just alluding to, many Tokyoites faced at the time, the Ginza had become an urban mixing ground, a site of confusion, of bringing together, quite literally, East and West, meeting, touching, and erotically swaying to the rhythms of American swing and jazz, transcending their differences with body language, if only for the moment of the dance and for a price. Next slide, please. He goes on to say, all different types were mixing, however. It was not only Americans and Japanese who were mixing in the Ginza. As Paredes also points out, quote, all different Japanese types meet and mingle on the Ginza. He says, brightly colored kimonos and smart Western dresses are seen side by side with beggar's rags and the blue, oddly designed coats that mark the carpenters and artisans' trades, unquote. Next slide, please. Writing in Spanish in Universal on the same topic about El Broadway de Japón, Paredes remarks that, quote, in my translation here, more than 3,000 young women work as dancers in the Ginza establishments alone. Its ranks are filled each day with young women from good families who have never had to work at anything and now have to make their livelihood dancing in order not to starve to death, close quote. Next slide, please. So in addition to the matters of the commercialization of sexual desire and of the necessity of women to sell their bodies, these articles say something else. They articulate the emergence of a post-war global structure of a recreational cultural industry and how it worked hand in hand with the process of Americanization itself. Tokyoites had begun to take their first careful steps into the post-war structures of recreational commerce and to indulge their senses as best as they could. So Americanization was not just a process of cultural imperialism, it represented a complex model of border crossing, of appropriation, negotiation, mixing and confusion between the conquering and the conquered societies. Next slide, please. All of Paredes' articles from Asia focus on the persons marginalized to the borders of respectable society. Unruly and aggressive leftists and communists, prostitutes and pimps, maverick and entrepreneurial black marketers, the denizens of the demi-monde of self-indulgence, in other words. And he recognized them as mesmerizing symbols of the collapse of an old order and the emergence of a new. They were harbingers of a hedonistic, materialistic, American-style consumer culture. So Paredes' forays to the borders of this emerging new social space between the old and the new orders within Japanese society, between Asian and Western cultural and racial formations, between the victorious American occupiers and the defeated people of Japan, all constituted a radical initiation to the complexities of the new transnational modernity that was just around the historical corner. Paredes' articles in Stars and Stripes and Universal are preludes to the critique of social justice that Paredes would engage in with his scholarly work in Texas upon his return to his native borderland. So with his pistol in his hand, the book that we began with, written in 1958, would bear all of the marks of these lessons learned in Japan and Asia during the 1940s. Next slide, please. Now, as if the questions of national and cultural identity and citizenship were not significant enough in their own right, They became even more so in an acutely personal manner during the summer of 1950. After having spent 5 profoundly transformative years in Asia, Paredes wanted to return to Texas with his new Japanese Latina war bride, Amelia Nakamini. Next slide, please. Amelia Nakamini, the daughter of a Japanese diplomat father, seated to the left of Amelia, to the right of Amelia, and her mother, Julia, an Uruguayan Spanish-speaking mother to the left of Paredes, had been working, Amelia had been working at the American Red Cross office in the Ginza in downtown Tokyo, translating Japanese for English and Spanish-speaking American GIs, when this Mexican American GI from Brownsville, Texas, walked in the door and saw and heard Amelia. He said in an interview to me later, "Here was what I had dreamed about. We understood each other right away and very shortly decided to marry." Next slide, please. So in the years immediately after the war, Japanese nationals and their dependents were forbidden entry to the United States, even though no such restrictions had been imposed on German or Italian nationals. Because of this racist restriction, Paredes and his new bride, Amelia Nakamini, had thought about immigrating to Canada or Mexico instead. The future suddenly cleared when a law allowing entry into the US all, quote, alien spouses and minor children of citizen members of the US Armed Forces was passed in 1950. And so on September 13th, 1950, the Paredeses arrived in California as a newly minted war couple, where the questions of American citizenship, permanent residency, national affiliation, the key questions of today's border region, in other words, very much on their minds. Next slide, please. Paredes returned to Texas with the experience of having witnessed firsthand how everyday life, folklore, and history from below serve as the repositories of knowledge from a subaltern perspective. Concerning that kind of vernacular knowledge, Paredes would later write that, quote, folklore is of particular importance to minority groups such as the Mexican Americans, because their basic sense of identity is expressed in a language with, quote, unofficial status, different from the one used by the, quote, official culture. Next slide. So, in contrast to official narratives of history, folklore offered for Paredes another kind of knowledge. Folklore was vernacular history in the making, sometimes offering the only surviving evidence of that other history, censored and mutilated by the official narratives of the conquering nation. Thus, of history, Paredes would claim that, quote, history, oral and written, is a dynamic process that is always open to change. It tends to reshape itself according to the half-conscious desires and yearnings of those who behold it, changing a detail here, a name there, making it less what it probably was than more what it should have been, unquote. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, let me just say that in his writings from Japan, Paredes can be seen to be working out the patterns of interaction among history, folklore, and the particular features of national culture that will be the focus of his later work. The questions he poses in fiction and in journalism from occupied Japan are at the core of the work in Texas. Ideas of national belonging and the identity of the polity. And they continue to be vital questions as we see today. The vast transformation of the border into a militarized zone where a humanitarian crisis has been created by state-sponsored denial of human rights. It is rather one very important moment in the prehistory of late 20th century hemispheric thinking that Paredes is providing us. He is providing us an image of what it really is to be and to live within two worlds. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saldívar. Yes, round of applause.
Sorry for the little fumble there at the end.
No, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing.
Sure.
So I'm going to hand it over now to Jesus for the Q&A portion. If anyone still has lingering questions for Dr. Saldívar, feel free to shoot them to our Q&A moderator in the chat. But yeah, I'll hand it over to you, Jesus.
Okay. Hi. Thank you for that. Amazing. Great stuff. But I'm going to read the first question here in the chat. And it's, in your opinion, what is one of the most valuable lessons we can learn from Paredes' work?
That I learned, or that one learns?
That in general, one learns from his work, but in your opinion.
Yeah, I think that that's an excellent question, and I think it's exactly the right question one should ask. And I think the easiest way for me to answer it, or at least to begin an answer, is to say, well, it depends. It depends what you're interested in. If you're interested, for instance, in Mexican American food culture, Paredes has a lot to say about that. And he can, and one of the things that he would say would be, food culture is not just a minor thing. It's not an insignificant matter. It is the basis for culture itself. And so one thing that you can do, if you're interested in finding out the complexity of a social structure, is by looking at the basics, and food is one of them. Why, for instance, for over 300 years on the border, the Rio Grande Valley, all the way up through into Western Texas and into New Mexico, why do the border people who live along the river eat the same things? Tomatoes, cilantro, chile, frijoles. So there's a long history there, and it tells you something about the economic structures as well. And okay, if you're interested in food, you can go there. But I think that's a roundabout way of saying is that Paredes, I think, has a lot to tell us, even today, 10 years, 20 years after his death, about the way in which people who are different fight it out, but sometimes in that fight gain something immensely positive in their knowledge about one another. I think that's certainly one of the major directions that his scholarship goes. Yeah.
Right. Good answer. That kind of also answered one of the questions I had, which was the importance in the larger context. But I come now, like hearing you talk about Americo, I guess an important aspect of the show is lineage and legacy and pass down of knowledge, and I'm interested in your relationship with Paredes personally, and how he was with you, and I mean a lot of your writings have bounced off of some ideas that he's laid down, and so
sure,
I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah. Well, that too is we could be here for many hours if you get me started on my personal interactions with Américo Paredes. Those of us who were his colleagues and friends called him Don Américo. So that's how I think of him.
Just a lot of respect.
Yeah. As an undergraduate at UT Austin, UT is a big place, obviously, and lots of people and lots of interactions. And frankly, I found it difficult as a first-gen student from Brownsville coming to the big university to get to know my professors. They just didn't seem approachable to me. And so I didn't get to know Américo Paredes when I was an undergrad. He was already, a senior member of the faculty in English and anthropology, folklore, and Mexican American studies at UT Austin when I was an undergrad. So I left. I got my undergraduate degree. I got my PhD at Yale, and lo and behold, 4 years later, what happens? But UT Austin had a job exactly in my specialties. And so I was hired. So I wound up back in Austin, which I was very, very glad. I had several other job offers, but UT Austin was my first choice. Living in Austin was my first choice. So I returned, and one of the first things I did as soon as I arrived back in Austin was I told myself, I'm going to, really just buck up my courage and walk up to Don Américo Paredes' office, knock on his door, and introduce myself. And I did, but he wasn't there. So I left him a little note, dear Dr. Paredes, I'm Ramón Saldívar, blah, blah, blah. I would love to be able to get to have a cup of coffee with you someday. And I wouldn't have been surprised if he didn't reply to me. Why should he waste his time on somebody he doesn't know, just a young professor? But he called me back right away the next day, and so we went out for coffee, and it became a tradition that he and I and several other faculty members in other departments, anthropology, history, sociology, would get together, and we would have coffee once a week across the street from the main UT campus. And so he was always kind and very much of a mentor for the group of us. And so there's much more to tell you, but I'll end this with this anecdote. Many years later, after his death, when I was writing the book that became The Borderlands of Culture, I was browsing through the archives at the Benson collection there in the UT libraries. And I came across, of course, the Paredes papers. I was looking for them. And, there's hundreds and hundreds of files, boxes that fill the whole wall. And they were all chronologically ordered and alphabetically in order, and I thought, wow, he was really well organized. I decided, what else? Let's look up Ramón Saldívar, see where I am in those files. So I started digging through the boxes, and there, sure enough, was the folder, Ramón Saldívar. I opened it up, and the very first thing I saw in that folder was that note I had written to him when I first arrived to UT. So he saved everything. He documented it like a true historian, like a true archivist, like a true scholar. You never know when these scraps of paper are going to lead you to bigger things. And I always took that as an indication of the kind of meticulous, careful, and deep thinker that Américo Paredes was.
What a great story. Thank you for sharing that. Another question in the chat. How was his work writing during the war received in Mexico? Or how could Mexican or Latinx audiences have understood his commentary on Japan?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question too. Well, first of all, I'll emphasize, what I hope came through in my talk, that being born on the border, that means that part of his family lived on the northern bank, and part of his family lived in the southern bank. Paredes had brothers who were born in Brownsville, like he was, but he also had brothers who were born in Matamoros and other little, communities outside of Matamoros. So the Paredes family spread, with no division by the national boundary line. And it was different in those days, obviously. And so he was totally and completely bicultural and bilingual. He was perfectly fluent and very well educated in Spanish as well, obviously, as in English. So when he got to Japan and started writing as a journalist, he had been trained as a journalist in Brownsville. He had been a reporter for the Brownsville Herald. He decided, I'm writing for Stars and Stripes, and they're paying my salary. I'm in the Army after all. But how about if I make a little bit of extra money by trying to tap another audience? How about a Spanish-speaking audience? How about Mexico City? And that's how he latched on to Universal, the huge and very significant and very conservative Mexican newspaper still today in Mexico City. So that's how he, attempted to do it. He would write a piece. Sometimes it would turn out to be in English, and he would write the same piece in Spanish. Whoops. Okay, I don't know if I did that. The same piece in Spanish for Universal, or vice versa. He would write a piece and he would start writing in Spanish and publish it in Spanish, Universal, and then write it again in English for Stars and Stripes. So, he wasn't sorting out what he would say to a Spanish-speaking audience and what he would say to an English-speaking audience. He was really just trying to give, to document really, what it was like to live in a society that was no longer in control of its own destiny, that was totally and completely at the mercy of the conquering forces of another culture, that was forcing it to change in a direction that, so many Japanese had lots of questions about. And I think in the back of his mind, there was the analogy to the Anglo occupation of the American Southwest and the takeover after 1848 of Texas. It had happened a little bit earlier, of course, but of New Mexico, Arizona, California, the entirety of the Southwest, and the transformation of what had been a Mexican culture into a Mexican American one, under different educational, aesthetic, political, sociological foundations. And so I think he was always interested in that. When he returned to Texas in 1950 and started working on his BA, because he didn't have a college degree when he returned, and then his PhD all at UT, I think his experiences, first of all, as a resident of the border region of Brownsville, Texas, and then his experience in Japan, in China, and in Korea were part and parcel of a general question that he was asking about: how do cultures interact? How do we get something positive out of horrendous conflict and antagonism? And I think that's why he sought to reach an audience both in English and in Spanish.
All right. Thank you. Do you happen to know, I guess during your conversations with Paredes and your research, did Paredes ever make any mentions of his own position as a Mexican American?
Oh, yeah.
And perhaps in his Stars and Stripes article or one of his columns. But
yeah, no, definitely. He definitely saw himself as a Mexican American. Really, I mean, the term that was used by Mexican Americans when he was growing up was Mexico Tejano, a Mexican Texan, and that was very clearly to emphasize, one, that he was not an immigrant to his family. Were not an immigrant family to the U.S. They were native settlers and inhabitants of the region from the 1700s, from the colonial period when José de Escandón brought the first Mexican settlers into the region, and his family was one of the colonial families. He wanted to emphasize that his roots were to that mixed cultural situation that was the border as he knew it as a young man and then as an older man. Mm-hmm. Remember, I said that he had brothers who were born on the other side of the border, on the Mexican side. And he told me that his older brothers, 2 or 3 of them, I forget how many, would often say to him, the US is not a good place for us. There's so much injustice and racism. You cannot get ahead there. Why don't you come to Mexico and just become Mexican completely and fully like we are? And then he said to me, I love Mexico, but from what I see of its politics, I'm not sure I think it's that much better. He had his roots in Texas, and so he had decided to stay. But I think that conflict between the two, as well as the juncture between the two, was part of the conversation he had with himself all the time.
And so do you happen to know about his family and how his children felt growing up in a Japanese Mexican American household, and how that might have changed their sense of identity?
You should ask them, because I think at least one of them, and I think 2 of his sons still live in Austin, but Alan Paredes is one of them. But in any case, no. I think that two things to understand. Amelia, remember, Nakamini, was half Japanese.
Right.
Her father was a Japanese diplomat stationed in Uruguay right before the war. When the war began, all of, I think all, maybe not quite all, but certainly the Uruguayan and many other Latin American countries expelled Japanese diplomats, as did the US. And so they had to leave Uruguay in 1939, I think it was, and return to Tokyo. So she lived as a young girl and then as a young woman in Tokyo for the duration of the war years, under the especially dreadful in the years from 1943, 44, 45, when Tokyo and all of Japan was heavily bombed by American bombers. She survived all of that, and so had a real affinity and tie through her father and her brother to who didn't return, who didn't move to the U.S. but stayed in Tokyo all his life. So a real connection to the Japanese side of her family. She was fluent in Japanese as well as Spanish and English. And I think she too sort of had to negotiate the differences, the challenges of being between those very different worlds.
Right.
Latin American, Mexican, US, Japanese, that's a lot of betweenness.
Right. So, okay, where can we make more progress in academia, media, in breaking stereotypes? And I guess that can kind of relate to your current work with, the racial imaginary.
Yeah. I think that it's also an excellent, really important question and a difficult one. I think that's what those of us who are from the border region are particularly attuned to. And all that I can say, because that's a complicated question and I don't have time for, we all don't have time for a full answer to this, and that is that it's a never-ending issue. It's not like one day we're going to wake up, oh, that's great, we solved that one. Let's take out another big problem. I think what Paredes always felt, and that's what he says about history, the passage that I quoted at the very end, it's always changing, but it doesn't change by itself. You make it change, but not you by yourself. And it's that sense of confluence, of collaboration, of community, of working not as an individual, but collectively, that can create the possibilities for a different, better kind of life. And I think Paredes really believed that.
Great. I think that's a good spot to end it. That was really great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. And thank you to the audience for those great questions as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saldívar. This was really wonderful. And yes, thank you to everyone for coming this evening and joining us.
My pleasure.
And if you are in Austin and are able to come to the VAC to check out the show, I highly recommend it. Between Two Worlds is on view through November 20th, and you can head to our website to schedule an appointment. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Saldívar, and thank you to Jesus for organizing this and for organizing such a fantastic exhibition. We are thrilled to host it, and this has been really wonderful. Thank you all for joining this evening.
Enjoyed it. Take care.
All right.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.